started anyway. So, my name is Miriam Tickton. I am a faculty member here in anthropology and the co-director of Joburg Institute on Migration and Mobility with Alexandra Delano, who's sitting right over here. And we have the pleasure of welcoming you here today for our second event in our 2014-15 lecture series, which has the theme Rethinking Refugee Spaces, Architecture, Design, and Politics. As some of you know, we launched the Institute in the lecture series on September 30th with a conversation with International Rescue Committee President David Miliband. And you can actually see that online now on our Joburg Institute website. So we chose the theme Rethinking Refugee Spaces to pay particular attention to space and how it can be an area for political contestation, oppression, and action. And being at the New School, we thought we would think about the connections between design, architecture, and politics. You know, can one design better spaces of exile? What does it mean to do this? Does it take away from other kinds of politics? So we were thinking of all kinds of spaces when we thought about this, from kind of classic refugee camps to DIY urban spaces to detention centers. And in fact, our next event is going to be, it's November 17th, and it's called The Spatial Ordering of Exile, Architecture of Palestinian Refugee Camps, with an organization called Campus and Camps, and architects Alessandro Petit and Sandy Halal. So we wanted to use this lens to examine the most contentious and important issues around immigrants and refugees today. And as we all know, one of the most pressing issues in the United States has been the increasing numbers of unaccompanied minors who've been crossing borders and fleeing violence in Central America. So we're just so very lucky that we have Jacqueline Bhabha with us today, who will speak about child migrants and spaces of exception. So before I introduce her, I just want to say thank you to Global Studies for co-sponsoring this, and to Brandon Fisher and Patrick Giaski and Douglas de Toledo Pisa, for all of you for making this happen. Thank you so much. Okay, so Jacqueline Bhabha is the FXB Director of Research and Professor of Practice of Health and Human Rights at the Harvard School of Public Health. She's also the Jeremiah Smith Jr. Lecturer in the Law School at Harvard and an adjunct lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. So she wears many hats and does many amazing things. She received a first-class honors degree and an MSc from Oxford University and a JD from the College of Law in London. From 1997 to 2001, she directed the Human Rights Program at the University of Chicago. And before 1997, actually, she was a practicing human rights lawyer in London at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and at the European Court of Human Rights. And she's published extensively on issues of transnational child migration, refugee protection, children's rights, and citizenship. I just want to say I was introduced to Jackie's work as a graduate student when I read her 1996 piece in Public Culture called Embodied Rights, Gender Persecution, State Sovereignty, and Refugees. It was really one of the very first pieces published on gender-based persecution as a condition for asylum, and it really shaped so many people's careers. Actually, I feel like I really owe her a lot for shaping the direction of my career, because she opened up new areas of study, thinking about gender discrimination together with asylum and humanitarianism and human rights. So she's been a pioneer, really, in her feminist, critical, legal, and human rights work on asylum, again, on trafficking, on transnational adoption, and of course on the relationship between the movement and migration of women and children. She's really guided discussions inside and outside of the academy. She's been very influential. She's written countless articles. I just wanted to name a few to show kind of her interdisciplinary audience and span. So, for instance, in Human Rights Quarterly, she has a piece called Arendt's Children. Today's migrant children have a right to have rights? In the PMLA, that's the literary, the premier journal for the MLA, she has a piece called The Child, What Sort of Human? And in Differences, which is a journal of feminist cultural studies, she has The Mere Fortuity of Birth, Are Children Citizens? So her work is really more recently focused on migration and the movement of children, and she edited a volume in 2011 called Children Without a State. This fall, just as the issues, or I guess summer and fall, just as the issues of undocumented migrants and minors, was all over the news, she came out with this book, Child Migration and Human Rights in a Global Age, which is a fantastic book. And it actually is coming out, came out the same time as another edited volume of hers called Human Rights and Adolescence. So she's really kind of the main voice on all of these debates in all these fields, and she's been speaking on radios and on, you know, writing op-eds and so on, so I would urge you all to check them out. Jackie Bhabha serves on the board of Scholars at Risk Network, which is, of course, linking her to the New School's history. She also serves on the World Peace Foundation and the Journal of Refugee Studies. She's a founder of the Alba Collective, an international women's NGO currently working with rural women and girls in developing countries, in particular in India, to enhance financial security and youth rights. So we feel so lucky to have her with us today to help us understand the issue of child migrants, and I want to welcome Jackie Bhabha and thank her for coming.
Thank you, Miriam, for that very generous introduction. I should say it's a real pleasure to be here for many reasons. Partly because I think one of the very first, as I just mentioned to some of you, one of the very first pieces I read years ago that really influenced my thinking about refugees was a piece co-authored by Aristide Zolberg, who was really a towering figure for me in thinking about the relationship between violence and the state and refugee protection. So, you know, he's identified with the school, so it's actually really a pleasure to be here. And I think also, as Miriam mentioned, because of the work that we've been involved in with Scholars at Risk, which has such a huge debt of gratitude and of history to the New School's kind of pioneering leadership with the University of Exile, which was really, the New School was really the leading institution that took the kind of rights and needs of persecuted scholars under Nazism and fascism seriously, and then sort of got other American universities involved. So we now have a sort of latter-day University in Exile called Scholars at Risk, which really is sort of built on that legacy. So it's really a pleasure to be here. When I spoke to Miriam about this series, this provocatively titled series, Rethinking Refugee Spaces, Design, Aesthetics and Politics, I did tell her that I think I would focus most on the politics and on the policy, and I have to admit that is what I've done, because that's where my expertise is. But I think, of course, the question of the space that migrants and particularly refugees occupy in the course of being subjected to the politics that they face is a very critical part of their experience. And so I hope that can come into my talk in some way. So my talk is entitled Child Migrants and Zones of Exception, of course, referring to our government's work on spaces of exception and the refugee experience. Child migrants, including child refugees, have long occupied a distinctive space in our complex polities, a twilight space within the broader zone of exception occupied by migrants more generally. Between light and dark, between law and custom, between rejection and reception. But where adult migrants generally encounter well-formed regimes, whether welcoming or hostile, with increasingly clear norms and rigorously articulated regulations and practices, children generally do not. What they encounter instead is a welter of half-baked policies, confusing procedures, improvised rules, untrained personnel, unpredictable delays, and often contradictory practices. At first sight, this distinctive twilight space reserved for children is perplexing. Why are the most vulnerable and apparently innocent of migrants the recipients of peculiarly deficient state practices and services? Why does the presence of child migrants within the refugee or undocumented or trafficking population always seem to take administrators and politicians by surprise? I first encountered this problem decades ago when I was working in Chicago, when I pondered the case of a 6-year-old girl from India sold by her parents to an agent in India who attempted to bring her to New York to work as a domestic for a wealthy Indian family, something that happens all too often. What surprised me when I got involved in this case was the vacuum of law, policy, and procedure into which her circumstances seemed to fall. There were no precedents. There was no trained personnel. There was no clear regulatory framework. There was really no space that she could occupy. How is this possible, I asked myself? How is it possible that a particularly vulnerable, very young child should end up unrepresented in a Chicago detention center for months on end? This question, why do child migrants continue to occupy this twilight space within both our systems of refugee and migration law on the one hand, and on the other hand within the domestic child welfare and child protection system? This question was the driving force behind the book that Miriam just mentioned, and it's taken me best part of a decade to try to find an answer. In the process of wrestling with that question, another equally troublesome issue concerning child migrants and their zone of exception has also preoccupied me. What is the cost of inaction or the failure to act that results from our deficient approach to child migration, from our failure to move child migration out of this twilight zone? What harms flow from the continued relegation of child migration to a space outside the bright light of day, a space of rights framed, a space which is framed by regulation and protection? Or to put the same question differently, what are the benefits, direct and indirect, that would flow if we located child migration within the center stage of domestic and international law and policy instead of at its margins? What would be the consequences? So I hope to explore both these questions with you today. The first question has implicitly been answered repeatedly. So the question of why are children doing so badly? Why are child migrants kind of, in a way, not catered to? Why do they occupy this sort of limbo space? Both actually materially, but also in terms of law and policy. So this question has been answered implicitly by many. Human rights investigators, child migrant advocates, sympathetic politicians, and occasionally even judges have grappled with this manifest failure to accord consistent, transparent, and rights-respecting attention to the complex challenges that face child migrants. We've, of course, seen this most recently in this country this year. Since April and May, the so-called surge of unaccompanied child migrants has been headline news. President Obama called it a humanitarian crisis earlier this year. And policymakers across the spectrum have bemoaned the utter lack of preparedness for the 60,000 to 80,000 unaccompanied children who've come across the southern border, a roughly tenfold increase on the annual average that we'd seen for a decade before. Some have criticized the Customs and Border Control officers for being ineffective in implementing policies, arguing that this irregular flow should simply be turned back summarily. What they've argued, and we've seen this again and again in the press, and not only in the press, in Congress too, and certainly in the southern states, they have cited the precedent that has existed for decades for Mexicans, where the policy is simply to return unaccompanied children back across the border to the good offices, or good or not so good offices of the Mexican authorities. And so critics of the current policy have argued that the same policy should be applied vigorously to so-called OTMs, other than Mexicans, which is what everybody else is. And in answer to those who've argued that the children might have asylum claims and that they're coming, as was just mentioned, from harsh conditions, the critics adamant. They say that today's vulnerable children quickly turn into tomorrow's gang members or undocumented workers. So we shouldn't be too fooled by this kind of undocumented vulnerable child population. So the failure to roll out a well-prepared exclusion policy, in fact, targeting these children, has in fact galvanized nativist fears, xenophobic organizing, and of course we've seen so much of that in recent months. On the other end of the political spectrum, advocates have criticized the policy lacuna from an opposing perspective. So they've drawn attention to the inhuman detention facilities, more reminiscent of jails in the global south than for children's facilities in the wealthy north. So to spend a little minute just thinking about the detention space, and some of you may have seen the YouTube clips or the articles about this, but the space in which these unaccompanied children have been detained has really drawn heated criticism, and I think for good reason. many of these facilities are located really in the middle of nowhere, at least 3 hours drive from the nearest city, from the nearest center of an immigrant community, of language skills, let alone of immigrant lawyers. So you have this placing of a particularly vulnerable population, really. I mean, I visited some of these places in the middle of the desert in Arizona, in Artesia, which is 3 hours away from the nearest city in Texas. So that conscious decision to site these detention facilities out of reach of advocates, out of reach of immigrant communities, I think is something worth thinking about. And for those of you who work on refugee issues, you might well be reminded of what happens in Kenya and in countries in Africa, where you have Dadaab, you have other big refugee centers sited far away from the big cities, and the same sort of principle of exclusion and containment. But it's not just the distance from the possibility of support and advocacy that's, I think, of great concern. The spaces themselves are really alarming. One of the things that the kids complain of most is the temperature, oddly enough. They're freezing, these places. They're air conditioned. And so for some of us that would actually be welcome, given that they often are sited in the middle of the desert. But these are undernourished, underclad kids used to the Central American climate. And so the children are shivering and can't get warm at night. So it's actually a really perverse policy, which has been pointed out for years. It's not as if this is something that the authorities aren't aware of. Both the low temperature and having neon lights on 24/7, so when you're sleeping the lights are always on. The facilities are extremely overcrowded, and now since April and May, the kids are literally, there are mattresses, many of them not clean, just strewn on the floor, so that's where the kids sleep. So this is what actually has happened. This is the space that these children have occupied. More than that, I mean, as bad as that, I think, but in a different dimension, there's obviously a dramatic absence of trained personnel. So one of the things that most of these child migrants complain of is that nobody knows what's going to happen to them. And it's true, people don't know. So when they say, well, how long am I going to be here? Where will I be able to go next? When can I try and phone my auntie? People genuinely, the detention, the border guards and the detention staff generally say, I don't know, and they don't know. Trained personnel is simply not accessible, let alone advocates who can actually represent the kids. So many of the volunteers who've worked in these facilities over the summer trying to do some sort of advocacy and trying to get asylum cases prepared talked about the dismal and depressing and traumatizing experience that these kids are having to face after the arduous journey. So to get back to our question, why is this the case? The common answer to this situation by parties on either side of the bifurcated field that I've just outlined has been the following. So when people ask, why is there no proper procedure? Why aren't there clear regulations? Why isn't there a right to free legal representation? Why aren't there guardians who can come to represent these children, as happens elsewhere? Why is this always surprising? Why are we underprepared, given that we've seen, admittedly not at this scale, but we've seen this migration? Some of us have been working on this for at least 10 years. So why? And the preferred answer to this question is widely supported both by people who are kind of critical and by people who are critical of the authorities, critical of the restrictions, and by people who are sort of defend them. And the answer basically is that we don't have good policies because child migrants are generally invisible. They fall through the cracks. They don't have a political constituency, they don't really have a voice, there isn't really a body of organized public opinion that advocates for them, and of course they don't advocate for themselves. They're trying to keep kind of body and soul together. So the answer really is that they fall between the cracks, that they're invisible, that on the one hand they're really not a primary concern in the immigration field, focused on workers, focused on family reunification headed by adults. So children are kind of assumed to be traveling with adults. They're assumed to somehow fit into the general pattern, but there's no direct focus. And on the other hand, they don't really fit into the child welfare field because the concentration there is on domestic children who live here, and the complexities of immigration law are certainly not part of the training of child welfare workers. So you have this chasm. So that's the argument. So the argument really is that it's not a surprise that we have these confusing policies in multiple different jurisdictions because we don't have skilled personnel. And indeed, just to digress for 1 second, in the case of the 6-year-old girl I mentioned, the reason I got involved was because the advocate who was representing her said, I have no idea what to do. I'm an immigration lawyer. I have never represented a 6-year-old girl. I don't know how to take instructions from a 6-year-old. I'm not a guardian. I'm not a social worker. What am I supposed to do? And many immigration lawyers have that sense. You know, representing children is a particular expertise. You know, the way you ask questions, the sorts of things you need to find out, the sorts of red flags you need to be careful about. So, you know, it's a particular expertise, and that expertise is in very short supply. And so I think that there is some merit to this argument. I think that certainly the institutional failure to really think about child migrants as an area of concern amongst those of us who work primarily in the immigration and refugee world, has led to, for many years, to really just a lacuna. Nobody thought about children having specific needs. Nobody thought that children in significant numbers could be unaccompanied. The idea was that when a child's unaccompanied, it's a one-off. And so you use discretion, and you use kind of discretionary means. And the trouble with discretion, for anybody who's worked in that particular institutional space, is that it's awkward and difficult, and it goes to the bottom of your filing. In the old days, your filing cabinet, and now it sticks at the end of your email. Things, but you don't have a clear policy. You know, you don't have the time to really think through, well, how am I going to exercise this complicated balancing act? What are the repercussions for me as a decision maker of making a decision of my own where I don't have clear guidelines? So those are the reasons why these cases basically linger on and on and on and take much longer than adult cases to resolve. So I think that there is some merit to this argument about invisibility, and certainly on the child welfare and child protection side, again, child migrants were really just too complicated to deal with, and insofar as they were dealt with, they were just dealt with as domestic children, and so the immigration and refugee complexities were ignored. And so one of the things that ended up being really problematic was that children would be okay while they were children, and then all of a sudden they turn 18, they age out of foster care, and lo and behold, they are undocumented and they face deportation because nobody thought that they really had an immigration problem which needed to be solved. So that gives you a sense of this sort of vacuum, this space of exception, of indeterminacy. But I think, and my argument in the book too, is that invisibility is not good enough. It's not really an adequate explanation. And there are really a couple of reasons why I would argue that. Firstly, you do actually have a long history of child migration. You know, if you look back in legal history, way back in 1924, at the time of the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which is the precursor to today's Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is one of the first international documents, there is mention of child migrants, and there was concern after World War I about children who were orphaned and children who were unaccompanied. And then again, after World War II, with the International Refugee Organization, child migrants, child refugees were singled out in the constitution of the IRO, the International Refugee Organization, as one of only 4 groups that needed special attention. And then, of course, there have been numerous treaties on trafficking, and now we have a Convention on the Rights of the Child, which focuses one whole article in quite some detail on child refugees. So to say that this problem is one of invisibility is not really completely convincing. And certainly for those of us who've worked in the US, it's true in Europe too, children and unaccompanied children have been arriving for a long time, and some of us old enough to remember the case of Elian Gonzalez, nearly actually 14 years ago, just around Thanksgiving, which, you know, if any case galvanized attention, that case did. So you couldn't fail to realize that some children did, for whatever reason, arrive on their own. So I think that just in terms of our own history, it's a pretty flawed explanation. And we need to think of why that explanation still carries so much weight. If you pick up any human rights report even, you'll see this term falling through the cracks, invisibility as an explanation. So I think there is an issue there which certainly we need to think about. But I think even more important than that historical legacy is the reality of what we see in the treatment of children, which is not so much explained by invisibility. After all, it's not that all these children are just being let in, you know, because really we don't know what to do. So we're seeing them detained, we're seeing policies which expose them to very harsh treatment. We're seeing Mexican children being sent back across the border. We're seeing inconsistent decision-making in the courts. So my answer to this question about why, and it's something that I explore in the book, is that we really have this mixed, confused space around child migrants because we are ambivalent. We're deeply ambivalent. And in the book I explore some of the sort of theoretical underpinnings, actually looking at Arendt and looking at others, to work with Linda Bosniak, some of you may be familiar with, to look at how ambivalence actually really, in other contexts of migration too, has done some very valuable work. And I think that here, that really explains what we see. So on the one hand, how do you kind of instantiate this space of ambivalence, if you like? On the one hand, there certainly is a protective instinct and a protective set of responses. So we do see situations in which, just at the most kind of banal level, there were all these teddy bears brought to some of the detention centers in the southern states. You know, people feel this sense, oh my goodness, these little children all on their own, you know, crying and clutching a little bag with an orange, you know, it kind of tugs at your heartstrings. So there's that just very human sense of, my God, that could nearly be one of my children. Response, and more conceptually, there certainly has been some positive decision making in the U.S. There's a special category called special immigrant juvenile status, in an ugly abbreviation known as CJIS, which allows children who are abused, abandoned, or neglected to get a special status in certain circumstances. So there has been some movement towards a protective response that we see if we look at the whole terrain. But on the other hand, we also see a very different response, and here's where the ambivalence comes in. On the one hand, we policymakers, border patrol, detention center officials, immigration judges, think of children as being vulnerable and need of protection. And on the other hand, we have a harsh punitive response, which is evidenced, as I illustrated, by this idea that you just send unaccompanied children back across the border, even without contacting a carer or without having a guardian, that you still have a situation in which children are not entitled to free legal representation, which seems extraordinary to some of us. That you still have instances where teenagers are shackled and handcuffed when they're transported from the detention facilities to the courts. So you still also have a very punitive reaction. And anybody who visits the detention facilities where these child migrants are kept cannot but feel that this is a jail-like space, even though they have euphemisms like International Child Center and so on to describe them. So why is there this punitive response? And I think it's relates to something I've been thinking about more recently, which is the ambivalent response we have to adolescents more generally. So the little children, the 4- and 5-year-olds, I think, generally, there's some accommodation and there's the protective instinct tends to dominate, so there will be some form of attempt to at least provide food and water and some sort of caring context. But the moment you get to 10 or 11, which of course is the vast majority of the unaccompanied children, there's this ambivalent attitude as that, well, they're children, but actually they're also juveniles. And juvenile, of course, has a very different affective ring from children. So juvenile, of course, slides into juvenile delinquent, slides into the possibility of being, if not a current, then maybe a future gang member. And of course, many of these kids actually have been gang members and they're fleeing gangs. And that's one of the things that's so difficult, that many of the applications that we see for asylum are based on fear of persecution by gang members. And so that's a complicated issue. It's a complicated issue for Congress to grant permission to gang members or former gang members and to say, well, we accept that you have a well-founded fear of prosecution, and we can discuss that more. There's also just a general sense of suspicion of these unattached young people. I interviewed the head of juvenile services for the Immigration and Naturalization Services that then was some years ago, and I said, why are these detention facilities so horrid, and what's the issue about people shouting at these kids? And he said, well, these are either runaways or throwaways. That was his term, and that's the thinking, that these kids have either run away from something that maybe, come here to thieve and to burgle or to be delinquents, or they're throwaways, they're other people's responsibility. Why the hell should we assume this responsibility? They're not like our children. So I think that really captures the reason why we have harsh facilities, why we have very punitive return measures, why asylum is so hard to secure, even when there is so much evidence of violence and gang membership in some of the countries of origin. So what has the response been, and how can I sort of justify this claim that really ambivalence is what's motivating our current response as well? On the one hand, and if you just look at what the Obama administration has done since April and May of this year, I think it illustrates this perfectly. On the one hand, we certainly have had, finally, an increase in the allocation of funding for the representation of unaccompanied minors. So through various public programs, there's now a considerably enlarged pot of money to train advocates and to pay people who represent children. So that's welcome. It's not enough, but it's a huge step ahead from the situation. There was really no funding at all, and it was all either law clinics in law schools, or it was pro bono lawyers, from the big law firms, or it was a handful of NGOs with funding from Angelina Jolie, typically. That was really what provided legal representation until the surge. So that's definitely an improvement. That's one step ahead. Secondly, there is much more interest now in thinking through a possibility of guardianship. And some of us have argued for a long time that guardianship is critical. Here you have children who have no anchoring. I mean, they don't speak the language. They have fled, or they've left intolerable home conditions. Maybe one of the things that used to happen very often is the grandmother who was looking after the child dies. Parents are here, undocumented. The child really is, either a street child joins a gang or comes here, or maybe in sequence there's one and then the other. So guardianship is really a critical, basic human right for the best interest of the child. And yet that's been something that's been non-existent. So now there's a couple of programs, I can talk about them more if you're interested, which started very much ad hoc, actually, at the law school in Chicago, which are now being replicated. So again, with more generous funding than they've ever had. So that's also positive development. On the other hand, though, and this is, I think, the proof of my claim about ambivalence, we've seen massive increase in the resources to remove children. We've seen massive increase, and this I think is what's particularly striking, in the contribution of funding to Mexico and Guatemala to shore up their borders, to make sure that kids don't come as far as the US. Training of Border Patrol in Mexico at the southern border of Guatemala, and of Guatemalans too, sort of dealing with Honduras and El Salvador. And also a very acute public information or disinformation sort of investment, warning children about the dangers that are coming, warning them about the risks of jumping on the trains and risks of amputation, warning them that there is no possibility of getting a legal status, warning them that they're going to be detained and sent back. So a real deterrent policy if ever there was one. So I think it's interesting to see this bifurcation. Some have argued, and we may or may not agree with this, that, just like there was the Kindertransport and there were measures to the Pedro Pan in Cuba, measures to bring children away from extreme situations and to exercise some sort of humanitarian engagement. So this is a situation which requires that. And we mentioned the colleague who I know has been associated with this institute, Professor Sergio Aguayo, who's probably the most eminent Mexican sociologist who's working on violence in Central America. And he says, you know, the collapse of the state and just the failure of state functioning is so dramatic that the idea that some of these children are not entitled to asylum is preposterous. The level of violence, the level of recruitment, even of little children by gangs, has reached such epidemic proportions that it's actually false as a matter just of international law to say that these children don't have, you know, a claim to asylum. So I think a lot more to be said about that, but I think to summarize, I think that there is this very ambivalent attitude fueled both by concerns about border security and gangs, fueled by suspicion of adolescents more generally, and of course nativism and xenophobia, and fueled by a sense that, you know, that if we let these children in, we're just going to be shoring up our undocumented population, and that therefore we should be addressing this vociferously. Okay, let me move on to my second question. I'm not sure how much more time I have, but I just want to leave time for discussion. But my second question really was this: what is the cost of inaction on moving child migration? What would be the cost of inaction? What is the cost of inaction of not moving child migration out of the twilight zone of exception? What harms flow from the continued relegation of child migration to a space which is outside the bright light of day, if you like, a space where rights are framed and where there is protection? Or to put the same question differently, what are the benefits, both direct and indirect, that would flow from locating child migration within the center stage of domestic and international law and policy rather than at its margins? So let me just have a word first about this cost of inaction approach, which we've actually developed, some colleagues developed, and there's a book called Cost of Inaction which follows the reasoning in much more detail than I can provide. But it is not a traditional cost-benefit analysis which attaches monetary value to different strategies and draws a balance sheet. So, you know, does it cost more to detain children, or does it cost more to send them right back? Does it cost more to have children in the school, or does it cost more to, you know, be fomenting gang activity, etc.? No. Rather, it's a strategy for addressing the consequences of omissions, failures to act in contexts that are of social interest importance. So I use this approach because I think it's a really useful tool, because the methodology is useful as a way of provoking thinking about our priorities and actually provoking discussion about priorities. So not assuming that we actually know what the priorities are, to engage in a public discussion with policymakers, with politicians, with activists about how we should address these problems of omission and what the priorities should be. So if you think this through a little bit, the cost of inaction approach, it requires you to think about not one action that you would take to remedy. You couldn't remedy the situation I've described of the child migrants with one action, but it makes you think about a set of actions that could have been taken to address an issue. So it makes you think out of the silo box. You're not just thinking about immigration law, you're thinking about immigration law, and you're thinking about child custody, and you're thinking about guardianship, and you're thinking about what about root causes in Honduras. You're thinking about a whole series of things. So it forces you to think, what are the actions, what's the set of actions that you would need to take to really get benefits rather than get these costs. So what I want to do in the last time that I have is actually switch focus away from our current domestic preoccupation with unaccompanied child migrants from Central America, and I want to talk about what is actually a much huger humanitarian calamity, which is Syrian child refugees. There has not been a calamity of refugee migration on the scale since World War II, and it's extraordinary that we don't have this in front of our agenda all the time. We think about the military consequences, of course, of the conflict in that part of the world, and, you know, the dilemmas about ISIS and drones and so on, but I don't think we think about this humanitarian calamity. It's really a huge area of omission. So So I would like to just spend a little time thinking about this. So if we think about the humanitarian crisis caused by the Syrian civil war, let me just give you a few little pointers about the cost of inaction, just to use this framework. So there are roughly, and I'm just talking about children and youth, and so I'm talking about under 18, which is the international definition. So there are roughly 1.4 million Syrian child refugees and IDPs. IDPs are internally displaced persons. So these are Syrian children who are still in Syria, but they've had to flee their homes. So to all intents and purposes, they're living in makeshift camps or living, just really outside cities which are not their own cities. 1.4 million, and here we are, rightly desperately worried about the 60 to 80,000. So the enormity of the scale is something I think we need to think about. And those who are refugees, children who are refugees, where are they living? They're living in a series, and this is where the conversation about space actually is really interesting and important. So they live, some of them live in refugee camps. Zaatari is the most famous refugee camp in Jordan, now so overcrowded that people are turned away. Extremely, and becoming an extremely dangerous place. So Zaatari is one. There are other refugee camps in Jordan where families and unaccompanied children live. In Lebanon, 1 in 4 people living in Lebanon, including Lebanese, 1 in 4 are Syrian refugees. So you can imagine the scale of the impact on a country which, of course, is already war-torn and has already had its fair share of refugee crises. There's been a lot of attention paid to Turkey recently. I actually spent 3 weeks in Turkey this summer. And the situation in Turkey is really interesting because on the one hand there is an open border, there has been an open border. The Turkish government, I think a complicated government maybe, but they certainly have had the border open and have a sense that those fleeing the Assad regime and the civil war are welcome in Turkey. But there are no proper facilities like in Lebanon, so there are no proper camps. There are makeshift camps, and if you spend any time in Istanbul, you see Syrian refugees just living rough on the streets, sleeping bags, and which is the situation in Lebanon where there are no camps at all. And so Lebanese Syrian refugees are sort of just like camping out with their own resources. So the spaces occupied by these millions of people are dire. And so we know a lot of the social and humanitarian problems are widely discussed. You only have to go to the UNHCR website to get as much information as you want, but I'll just give you a couple of bullets. UNHCR estimated at the end of September 2014, so just 2 weeks ago, that there were over 3.2 million persons of concern outside Syria. And they estimated that the funding needed to just address emergency concerns, emergency food, emergency health, and emergency shelter was 3.7 billion, of which so far they've received 1.9 billion. So there is a shortfall of 51% of funding. So that's why the World Food Programme 3 weeks ago announced that it was going to be cutting food subsidies to refugees by 40%. So we see here a crisis, I think, of dramatic proportions. But let me just point to a couple of things which I think are particularly consequential for children. So one is the legal framework, and there's actually, for anybody who's interested in this, Susan Akram, who's a colleague at BU, Boston University School of Law, has done with some of her students, a fantastic study of the legal framework in the surrounding countries surrounding Syria and what their law does or doesn't offer for Syrian refugees. And of course it's a complicated and rather troubling picture where there are huge lacunae in protection. Refugee Convention has not been ratified, and in many cases Syrian refugees have a limbo status, not only children or refugees. So there are very serious problems. One of the problems that flows from this lack of a robust legal framework is the problem of lack of birth registration and statelessness, which is what one of my books is about. And this sounds like a technical legal issue, but it actually isn't, because under Syrian law, a mother cannot register the birth of her child, only a father can. And many now of the refugees are female-headed households. I have actually got the percentage in here, but it's quite a sizable percentage, as you'd imagine, what with people either men and fathers being killed or being in, fighting in one way or the other. So you have many female-headed households in the refugee context. And in many of the refugee situations, in order to prove the identity of a child, you need to at least to have a marriage certificate. Now, anybody who knows anything about refugee flight and refugee situations knows that one of the hardest things for refugees to have documents. You don't go to the vault or to the municipality and get all your documents when you're fleeing for your life. So the risk of child statelessness is actually dramatic, and it's something that some of us are very worried about, because there's a whole generation of Syrian children born in exile who are going to be stateless, who are not going to have a legal identity, who are not going to have a passport, who are not going to be able to prove their entitlement to go to school, let alone to vote or to travel. So that is one huge cost of inaction, if you like. That's one huge problem. Secondly, there are huge health consequences, and again, this has been documented quite extensively, but maybe I can just give you a couple of figures. One is, according to UNICEF, just the rate of vaccination. We're not talking about, treatment for cancer or diabetes, just vaccination of children. And we all know now with this pandemic that we're, staring in the face how important vaccination, where we do have a vaccine, is. Vaccination in Syria used to be 99% in 2011. After all, these were, very robust health systems. And we don't have more recent figures, but just 1 year later, in 2012, the vaccination rate had dropped to 52%. So here again is another real problem staring us in the face. To say nothing of the dramatic evidence of stunting and lack of food, that many of these children demonstrate. So they're sort of below the age, they're wasting, they're very, undernourished. And then there's the psychological trauma, again, which has recently been documented, and there's some wonderful, and I can be happy to send references, there's some wonderful reports showing the extent of psychological trauma. I'll just give you two kind of indices of that. One is that aid workers working in the refugee camps have noticed this increase in insomnia and bedwetting among 5, 6, 7-year-olds, which is a classic example of distress. So children who have obviously experienced war and maybe loss of close relatives and are now in these situations where they're not really getting a supportive environment, are being constantly exposed to trauma. And secondly, among teenagers and adolescents, there's a spike in suicides and in suicidality. None of this is surprising, but it's still obviously very concerning. But the thing I want to focus on the most and spend my last remarks on is education. Because the evidence on the education front is, I think, the most concerning. So, according to UNICEF, over 60% of Syrian refugee children are not in school. Many have not been in school for 3 years. We, from the centre I work in, at the School of Public Health, have sent 3 rapid assessment teams, 2 to Jordan and 1 to Lebanon, to look at the circumstances of children and young people. And our colleagues come back and report the following, that some children in Lebanon, for example, are spending 6 to 8 hours a day just watching TV. Parents are frightened to let the children out of the space that they're in, and so they're just sitting there, watching cartoons or whatever. No schooling, no formal instruction, nothing that could be, really directed to actually alleviating this situation. Secondly, and this has also been publicized, there's a dramatic increase in child labor. I don't know if any of you heard the report by Lise Doucet, that's a wonderful journalist some time ago, where she documented the presence of, again, very young children in Lebanon working in the fields. Like she said, every morning at 6 o'clock trucks come and they take these 5 to 7-year-old boys to the fields and they're working and doing agriculture because the families need, the income that comes from that. So this dramatic increase in child labor among populations that when children were, 100% of the children were in school. So this is not, we're not talking about South Sudan, we're not talking about rural India, we're talking about situations where the population had a completely different set of expectations. And thirdly, and this was something again we documented, but you might have seen it in the New York Times recently, the steep increase in child marriage. So we know that a girl who's not being educated, who's out of school, is 3 times more likely to marry under the age of 18 than a girl who is in school, partly just because school uniform and school present signals are not available, but also, of course, being engaged in education protects children from the family making arrangements because they're in a secure space. But UNICEF reported, again, recently, that almost 1/3 of the registered marriages among Syrians in Jordan between January and March 2014 involved girls under 18. And so it's not just marriage, and many of these marriages, of course, are to much older men. Some of them traveling in from neighboring states and from the Gulf to kind of find these young brides. It's not just the threat of marriage and forced sex and violence. It's also the very real risk of pregnancy and higher maternal mortality that goes with early pregnancy. So these are really life-threatening situations. These are some of the costs of inaction. So how would a cost of inaction approach to thinking about potential benefits and potential actions address this? And how should we have a discussion rather than just the despair of the enormity of the problem, which is not satisfactory? How should we think about how one might move forward in this situation? So just from what I said, I think there are 5 issues we need to talk about. One is the funding gap and how that funding gap can be addressed. Why is there such a huge funding gap? Why is it compassion fatigue? I mean, there's clearly are funds for something. Military action is always funded. So why is this dramatic humanitarian need somehow underfunded, and how can that be addressed? What are strategies that could make this a political priority? And it's not just a question of charitable giving of individuals, though I'm sure that contributes, but it's really a question of why the international communities failed to get government support for intervention here. Secondly, and this I think is particularly important for those who are concerned with migration, how is it that there is no radical resettlement policy? How is it that all the burden of these 3.5 million refugees is being shouldered by the neighboring countries, which are already groaning under the strain? How is it that we have paltry numbers in Europe of Syrian refugees being brought out, paltry numbers in the US, paltry numbers in Canada? Norway just recently announced a relatively generous program, but I mean trivial numbers compared to the enormity of the need. How is that possible? How is it possible that there aren't resources to really screen refugees and quickly get them out of a situation which is unlivable? Thirdly, the question of education, refugee education, a basic right under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, a basic entitlement. You shouldn't discriminate against children, and yet, I skipped this part of my paper in the interest of time, but there's evidence, in some countries they have double shifts. In Jordan and Lebanon, they now have double shifts using teachers to teach, in the afternoon or after hours, and using the same facilities to try to accommodate the refugee children. Not a satisfactory approach because, how much can the teachers be expected to give, and the premises also creates wear and tear, but at least it's something. But in many situations, as I said, children are not in school at all. So here is an enormous need for thinking creatively. Should there be co-ops? Should all the Syrian teachers who are refugees be mobilized? Should there be other systems for thinking creatively about educational input? What are the language challenges that arise? In Turkey, for example, one of the things that we've been discussing with the groups in Turkey is Turkish, of course, a completely different language from Arabic. So what are the obligations on the Turkish state to provide education and language that the children can understand? And then, of course, you get into the more detailed question, what sort of syllabus should schools be teaching to children who come from a different system? So these are all questions which are complicated questions, but they have to be on the agenda. They have to be priorities for action. And they aren't necessarily even that expensive. If you think about all the teachers, if you think about all the aides, all the qualified personnel who are sitting around in these camps, several people we've been in touch with are talking now about the possibility of pressuring governments to just pay these people to work. But of course there's a hostility to refugees working. There's a whole protectionism about domestic labour force. So these are questions which are complicated but need addressing. So my fourth point actually was about labour opportunities more generally, because the dire poverty, of course, is also the lack of resources. People have used up all their savings. That's also fueling this, escalation in child labour and in child marriage. Child marriage is a way of getting resources by selling your daughter, so to speak. So having a more rights-respecting approach to income generation would be an important way of thinking about a solution and about an intervention. And then I think lastly, and probably most importantly, the enormous benefit that would flow from addressing this huge polarization that we have between the refugees with nothing and the possibilities of some sort of access to protection that is part of our humanitarian obligation and tradition. So some way of thinking beyond the immediate term about the benefits of having a generation who really are recipients of generous humanitarian intervention, rather than a generation who are despondent, angry, resentful, uneducated refugees. This is not going to end anytime soon. So for years, maybe even decades, sitting in camps, the consequences this has for the region, but even beyond the region, and without being alarmist, I think it's a very major issue, and you have millions of young people, children and adolescents who are, going to be semi-literate and who have grown up with memories of these sorts of deprivations, and of course evidence of increase in domestic abuse and child abuse and so on. So in violent situations where all sorts of behavioral anomalies flourish. So in conclusion, I think that we are to some extent trapped by our ambivalent attitude to child migrants and youth, and maybe to children and youth more generally. And this ambivalent reaction really pervades our failure domestically or in terms of our regional context here and more internationally, so that military solutions are seen as the surest guarantee of security rather than the most precarious guarantee of future security. And so the zones of exception that I've hinted at, and these sort of twilight spaces that children occupy, whether in camps or on the borders of cities or at the border, or even, say, within Syria, these become zones of despair, exclusion, and spiraling inequality. And they are potentially zones that were going to, I think, precipitate belligerence, and it's hard to imagine anything else. We've seen the example of Honduras and El Salvador, where gang membership and gang activity is one of the only real games in town. It's not, I think, too far-fetched to suggest that this may happen much more broadly. So I think that we have an obligation to think creatively and seriously about the benefits that we might be able to derive from addressing, like in a kind of hierarchy of options, and balancing the priorities we have and the resources we have to think how one might impinge, rather than simply having this polarized attitude, which is either, exclusion or kind of a benign, maybe to some extent naive protectionism, which is clearly not delivering. So I guess my final point is that as we perpetuate zones of exception for migrant children and youth, we incur huge cost of both justice but also of human security, with all that entails in the near and in the medium term. A public discussion about this aspect of global insecurity and polarization and its impact on the generation of millennials could not be more urgent.